In September of 1780, British Major Patrick Ferguson sent a message across the Appalachian Mountains. The men on the other side of those mountains, settlers in the remote backcountry of what is now Tennessee and western Virginia and the western Carolinas, had been sending militia east across the ridgeline to harass his loyalist forces in the Carolina lowlands, and Ferguson had decided to put a stop to it. His message was not a request, it was a threat. He warned the communities west of the mountains that if they did not lay down their arms and cease their opposition to British authority, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. The message was delivered through a released prisoner to make sure it found the right people. It reached them, and within a week, roughly 1,400 men who had no uniforms, no formal rank structure, no artillery, no supply chain, and no orders from any continental commander were gathering at a place called Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River with one collective intention: to find Patrick Ferguson and kill him first. Whatever Ferguson had calculated his message would achieve when he sent it across the mountains, this was not it. Not remotely. The British strategy in the American South in 1780 rested on a premise that the fall of Charleston in May had seemed to confirm. The southern colonies, the thinking in London went, were populated by large numbers of loyalists who had been waiting for the protection of the British Army before declaring themselves openly. Crush the continental resistance, garrison the territory, and the loyalist population would rise and hold it without requiring permanent British occupation or endless expenditure of professional troops. By August of 1780, that plan had achieved its most impressive result. At Camden, Cornwallis had destroyed what remained of the Southern Continental Army under Horatio Gates, a rout so complete that Gates himself was found 40 miles from the battlefield, still riding hard. With organized American resistance in the Carolinas effectively shattered, Cornwallis began moving north toward North Carolina, planning the final campaign that would roll the rebellion up from below. He needed his left flank protected while he moved. That assignment went to Major Patrick Ferguson, a 36-year-old Scottish professional soldier who was, by any measure, one of the most capable and creative officers in the British Army. Ferguson had designed and patented a breech-loading rifle years earlier that loaded far faster than standard infantry weapons, and he had briefly commanded a small experimental unit trained to use it before the project was shelved by Army bureaucracy. At the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, Ferguson claimed in his personal journal to have had George Washington himself in his rifle sights from roughly 100 yards, and to have chosen not to fire because shooting a man in the back while he was riding away struck him as beneath a gentleman soldier. Whether that account is accurate is impossible to verify, and historians treat it with varying degrees of confidence. What is not in doubt is that Ferguson was unusually talented, unusually aggressive, and unusually confident in his own judgment, which made him an effective officer in most situations and a catastrophic one in this particular case. His mission in the Carolina backcountry was to recruit Loyalist militia, protect Cornwallis's left flank, and suppress Patriot guerrilla activity. He executed the first two assignments with competence. He underestimated the third one badly. The communities west of the Appalachians were unlike anything Ferguson had encountered elsewhere in the Southern campaign. These were people who had moved beyond the mountains specifically to escape the kind of centralized authority he was now trying to impose on them. Men who had spent their adult lives subsistence farming, hunting, and fighting off Cherokee raids with no help from any government, British or colonial. Light Horse Harry Lee, one of the most perceptive officers in the Continental Army, later described them as a race of hardy men, familiar with the use of the horse and the rifle, stout, active, patient under privation, and brave. Ferguson saw them differently, dismissing them in his communications as disaffected banditti who could be cowed. His proclamation was built on that dismissal. What gathered at Sycamore Shoals in late September was not a traditional military force by any definition that the 18th century would have recognized. There was no single commanding general, no chain of command approved by any government, no official authorization from the Continental Army or the Continental Congress. 8 or 9 colonels from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Watauga settlements showed up with their own militia contingents, each man commanding the people he personally knew and was personally trusted by. Men who would follow him because they had hunted alongside him and borrowed tools from him and helped him raise his barn, not because of any rank on a printed commission. They elected William Campbell of Virginia as a nominal overall commander, but only after some dispute between colonels of roughly equal standing, and with the clear understanding that each colonel retained full control of his own men. They had no supply train, no tents, no artillery, no military surgeon, and no formal pay arrangement. They killed beef on the trail and cooked it themselves at the stops and went hungry when there was nothing to cook. A frontier clergyman named Samuel Doak sent them off from Sycamore Shoals with a sermon drawn from the Book of Gideon, the story of 300 men who destroyed an army of thousands by surrounding them in the night and attacking from every direction at once, which in retrospect reads less like a sermon and more like a briefing. By September 25th, they were marching southeast through the mountain passes in search of the man who had threatened their homes. Ferguson heard about the force coming for him and made a sensible decision. He retreated toward Cornwallis's main army, sending messages requesting reinforcements. Those messages never reached Cornwallis in time. On October 4th, the pursuing Patriot militia arrived at Gilberttown in North Carolina to find Ferguson had already left. On October 6th, at the Cowpens Cattle Ground in South Carolina, they received intelligence that Ferguson was a day's ride east of them and moving toward Charlotte to rejoin the main British force. The colonels met and made a critical decision. From a total force now somewhere between 1,400 and 1,800 men, which had been growing as word spread and additional militia companies joined from across the backcountry, they selected the 900 best marksmen on the 900 sturdiest horses and rode through the cold rain of that October night, covering roughly 35 miles before dawn to close the distance. The men who made that ride had not slept, had barely eaten, and arrived at the base of Kings Mountain in the early afternoon of October 7th with wet powder, cold hands, and rifles they had been carrying for days through rain. They came without a drum, without a regimental standard, without a commissary officer. They came with rifles and the intention to use them. Ferguson had meanwhile chosen his ground deliberately. Kings Mountain was not a mountain in the conventional sense, but a low, rocky, heavily wooded ridge rising roughly 60 feet above the surrounding South Carolina forest, its summit a long, narrow plateau about 600 yards from end to end and no more than 60 yards wide at its broadest point. Ferguson positioned his force of roughly 1,100 Loyalist militia along the summit and told his men, and by all accounts genuinely believed himself, that it was a position where the Almighty himself could not dislodge them. The logic appeared sound at first reading. Defenders on high ground had the advantage over attackers climbing toward them. Bayonet charges downhill could break advancing infantry lines. The steep, rocky slopes would disrupt organized assaults before they could gather momentum. Ferguson sent out requests for reinforcements to Tarleton at Charlotte and to the Loyalist garrison at Fort 986. Neither could get men to him in time. He settled in to wait on his impregnable hill. One thing worth being precise about before the battle itself, this was not, in the strict sense, a British army. Patrick Ferguson was the only professional British regular officer on the ridge that day. Every soldier under his command was an American loyalist, men who had chosen the Crown's side in what was, at Kings Mountain, a fight between Americans. The title of this story calls them a British army, and under British command, fighting for the British Crown, organized and supplied and authorized by the British military establishment, they were that. But the distinction matters because it shapes what the battle actually was, not a colonial rebellion fighting a foreign occupier on a remote hillside, but a civil war reaching one of its most violent expressions on a rocky summit 60 feet above the Carolina forest, with brothers sometimes on opposite sides of the same slope. What Ferguson had not accounted for was that every advantage the terrain offered defenders of a conventional position was reversed against a force of frontier riflemen who had grown up shooting targets through tree cover at 200 yards. The trees lining the slopes of Kings Mountain were not obstacles to the Overmountain Men. They were cover. The steep slope that made uphill charges difficult for conventional infantry made no practical difference to men who were not charging in organized lines, but moving individually through the forest, picking targets from behind rocks and trunks, stepping back down the hill when a bayonet charge came at them and climbing back up when it passed. Ferguson's loyalists had muskets, which could be loaded and fired 3 times a minute, but were accurate only to roughly 100 yards in open conditions. The Overmountain Men had rifles, slower to load, but accurate at 200 to 250 yards, and the tree cover on the slopes of Kings Mountain meant that Loyalist musket volleys from the summit were largely wasted against men who were not grouped in visible lines. The terrain Ferguson had chosen as impregnable was, in the specific tactical situation he was actually in, nearly ideal for the men attacking him. At 3 in the afternoon, the Overmountain Men began their approach through the surrounding forest. Each colonel had been assigned a sector of the ridge, and the plan was as simple as the terrain allowed: encircle the entire mountain and attack from all sides simultaneously, so Ferguson could not concentrate his force against any one threat. William Campbell reportedly told his men to shout like hell and fight like devils, and the combination of that instruction and several hours of pent-up determination from a night of cold riding produced something close to the intended effect. The first shots came from the southwest face, where Campbell's Virginians made contact with Ferguson's outer sentries below the rim of the ridge. Within minutes, the firing spread around the full perimeter as the other columns announced themselves in turn. Ferguson had no way to know what was happening on all sides at once, no clear picture of how many men were attacking or from how many directions. The sound, one Loyalist survivor later wrote, was like nothing he had heard in any battle. A constant rolling fire seeming to come from everywhere at once, accompanied by the high sharp yelling of the attackers that carried through the trees from every direction. Ferguson responded with energy and genuine courage. He mounted his horse, put a silver whistle to his lips to direct his officers, and led bayonet charges down multiple faces of the ridge in succession, trying to clear the attackers off the slopes below. The charges worked. Briefly, on each face they struck. American riflemen fell back into the trees when Loyalist infantry came downhill at them with fixed bayonets, and the summit stayed clear for the moments it took the charge to spend itself and the men to climb back up. But the Loyalists could not drive the attackers back on all sides at once, and every time a charge cleared one face of the ridge, the attackers on the opposite faces came further up. The summit narrowed with each successive sortie. Ferguson rode from point to point, visible on horseback in the distinctive checked linen duster he wore over his uniform, directing his men personally, blowing the silver whistle above the noise of the fight, rallying and repositioning with the same energy he had brought to every engagement of his career. He was conspicuous to every rifleman on the slope below, and he rode anyway. American marksmen singled him out. Ferguson's horse was shot from under him. He mounted another. That horse was shot. He mounted a third and led a final desperate attempt to break through the American line and escape, cutting a path through the encirclement with a small party of horsemen in a last bid to reach the British main force at Charlotte. For a moment the opening appeared. Ferguson rode through it. The Overmountain Men closed it around him. He was struck by rifle balls from multiple directions and fell from the saddle with his feet still caught in the stirrups, carried forward by his dying horse for a few yards before the animal went down. Contemporary accounts put the number of hits between 6 and 8. He died on the slope he had told his men was impregnable. Ferguson's second in command, Captain Abraham de Peyster of the King's American Regiment, raised a white flag. The ceasefire did not come immediately. Men who had spent months hearing about what Tarleton had done at the Waxhaws remembered exactly what giving no quarter meant, and cries of Tarleton's quarter and remember Waxhaws ran through the Patriot lines as some men kept firing after the flag went up. Patriot officers eventually restored order, but the period of continued killing after the surrender was real and documented from both sides, a direct consequence of how the war had been fought in the South that summer. When the shooting finally stopped, the count was one of the most complete destructions of a fighting force in the entire war. 290 of Ferguson's men were dead. 163 were wounded and captured. 668 were taken prisoner unhurt. Against a force that had begun the battle with over 1,100 men, those numbers left barely a handful unaccounted for, most of them men who had fled before the encirclement sealed. American casualties were 28 killed and 62 wounded. The battle had lasted 65 minutes from the first shot to the white flag. Ferguson was buried on the ridge where he fell, his body wrapped in oxide by his captors and interred in a shallow grave among the rocks at the summit. He remains there today, in the ground he told his men was impregnable. Kings Mountain is a national military park in upstate South Carolina, and Ferguson's cairn still marks the exact spot where, less than 3 weeks before his death, he had sent a message telling the people who killed him to stay home and be afraid. The news reached Cornwallis and Charlotte within days. He described what had happened at Kings Mountain in a letter to London as the first link in a chain of evils that doomed his southern campaign. A notably candid admission for a man whose public communications tended toward the formal and self-justifying. With his left flank gone, the loyalist militia of the backcountry shattered, and no realistic path forward into North Carolina without exposing his flanks to the same kind of coordinated militia attack that had destroyed Ferguson's force, Cornwallis retreated south to Winnsboro, South Carolina, abandoning Charlotte and surrendering the gains of months. He was also sick with fever, his army weakened by disease and the brutal pace of the Carolina campaign, and the combination of military defeat and physical debilitation forced a pause that the Americans used to regroup, recruit, and prepare for the next phase. Cornwallis would not mount a serious threat to North Carolina again until the following spring, and when he did, Daniel Morgan destroyed Tarleton at Cowpens in January of 1781. And the chain that had begun at Kings Mountain extended itself all the way to Guilford Courthouse, to Virginia, and eventually to the coast at Yorktown. Thomas Jefferson called Kings Mountain the joyful annunciation of the turn of the tide of success. The phrase captures what the battle meant without quite capturing why 900 backcountry farmers, with no orders from any continental authority and no supply chain beyond what they could carry on their horses, were able to produce it. The answer lies not in any one tactical decision or stroke of luck, but in the original miscalculation that made the battle necessary at all. Ferguson assumed a threat would produce submission. The people he threatened had spent their lives in a place where submitting to a threat that was then carried through meant the end of everything they had built, with no government close enough to protect them afterward. They had no theoretical commitment to the revolution in the abstract. They had a very practical understanding of what fire and sword would do to a community where there was no one else coming to help. And that understanding was more powerful than anything Ferguson had brought with him to Kings Mountain. The 65 minutes on that ridge was the direct consequence of the message he had sent across the mountains 6 weeks earlier, and of his fundamental failure to understand what kind of people it was being delivered to. Leave a like and subscribe if stories like this one are worth your time.